Hello everyone, Santier here, and I'm going to continue my Dark Souls 2 retrospective today by talking about a broad category that I'm calling character mechanics. So this is specifically talking about things with how the player character operates. So I have a bunch of different things that I've kind of listed out just to make sure that I'm going through things in a reasonably complete way for my thoughts. So, in no particular order other than the one that I wrote them down, I'm going to go ahead and go through these particular things, starting with agility. So, agility, for those who maybe have been a little bit a ways from Dark Souls 2, so you don't remember as well, agility is a sort of substat. This is something that Dark Souls 1 did a lot, is they have a lot of substats, where, like, raising adaptability, increased agility, and like poise and some other stuff. So you have a lot of these sort of substats, and agility is one of them. And what it specifically controls is your number of iframes, or invulnerability frames, when you roll. So when you have low agility, you have fewer invulnerability frames, and I think this has a lot of consequences for the game. It also affects the speed at which you use consumable items, at least especially like healing items like Estus. So I personally do not like agility. I think there are a couple of reasons why it isn't great. One of them is it just makes the game just feel worse at low levels. And this is bad because this is your player's first experience with the game. And it makes the game feel bad in the specific couple of ways. First of all, by making rolling less effective or more precise, it means that you have to be a lot more skillful to be able to successfully dodge, and that means you're going to get caught a lot more often in stuff, especially with the way that rolling feels like it leaves a lingering hitbox where it is that you start the roll. I'm not quite sure. I'd really love to be able to see debug data that would draw hit objects, that draw the various hitboxes and physics objects in the game, because it really does feel weird to me. But what I'm getting at with this is, like, that makes dodging just feel bad in your first experience until you actually get agility up high enough that you get enough iframes in your roll that it feels effective to dodge things. The other issue is by making consumable items like healing items very slow with low agility, it makes the game just overall feel clunkier. And this especially negatively affects low levels, which has a really nasty impact on the early and new player experience. This is a game that really incentivizes you to pump that particular stat just to make the game feel more like Dark Souls 1 in terms of playability and that sort of thing. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is spells, specifically. So, I enjoy playing with magic systems in the Souls games, and I like being able to have spells as part of my repertoire of things that I do. In general, I find myself wanting to make a character that can do everything before I start making some specialized characters, but I like to be able to use spells. And there are a bunch of spells in the game that, particularly over the life cycle of the game, its development cycle, the sort of period of tweaking, got repeatedly nerfed. And they got nerfed due to player feedback, and specifically there was a lot of complaints about people invading and one-shotting them, and there were a lot of complaints about the soul-consuming hexes, the damage-dealing hexes, but the thing about the magic in the game, and having played it again a bit recently, it wasn't quite as severe for some of them as I thought it was, but especially against players, because I did do a good bit of PvP in this game at one point in time. What ended up happening is that magic that wasn't like a weapon buff or something, was very ineffective because of these nerfs, because what you ended up having is skilled players could dodge magic very easily, so it was very hard to land a hit. And so you needed it to pay off very well, but when that happens, low-skilled players who aren't good at dodging magic would get absolutely destroyed by magic, so it was just very, very hard for them to balance it. What particularly hit hexes especially hard was that they had that ring that would buff hex damage. And the other thing is that hexes are technically a very heavy investment of attributes, because you need to have very high levels of both faith and intelligence to be able to use hexes effectively. And so that investment gets devalued when the spells are getting nerfed repeatedly, and it just makes magic just not feel as good to use when it feels very weak. So this is something that, in general, I wasn't a fan of the way that magic was getting repeatedly nerfed. And just as a general note, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit more later at some point in time, but the overall feeling that that stuff in the game was getting nerfed because of PvP aspects, particularly invasions, was really frustrating to me as somebody who liked some of these things. A really good example of this is Santier's Spear, which, for those who don't know, is this really cool secret. You find this spear that's embedded in a statue, off in kind of a hidden area in the game, and this weapon has a very high amount of durability, because durability automatically resets when you rest at a bonfire in this game. I'll talk about more about durability later, but the spear would get restored from being its durability being worn, but if you managed to wear down the durability, you'd break off the bit of statue. And then the weapon had a really potent moveset and had a lot of flexibility, and was a really strong weapon if you went through doing it. Now, the internet being what it is, and gaming being what it is these days, that means that this cool secret thing was like everywhere, because this is a prime example of there's no hidden information in PvP focused games, right? Like, this stuff gets known, people learn how to find it, all that sort of stuff. And that would be fine, except for the PvP elements, and when the weapon is very powerful for PvP, it damages that. It feels like they put a lot of time into trying to balance the PvP, perhaps not entirely effectually. But anyway, that was something that the spells being nerfed and stuff was something that really frustrated me as somebody who likes my spells to feel like they're effective and powerful and stuff. And then the next thing that I want to talk about was the critical hits and the way that these were nerfed coming from Dark Souls 1. So this is specifically, I'm talking about backstabs and parries. Riposte is technically the critical hit off of a parry, but that is not the action that was affected per se. Like, it was definitely changed in how it feels, but the way that parries were affected. The backstab one, again, that feels kind of like a PvP thing to try to address some of the issues there, and it feels like parry likely was done that way too. But the problem that I have with these, I don't care that much about the backstab change of needing to like land that initial hit in order to like hit confirm your backstab. But the parry nerf change, just to kind of explain for those who maybe aren't entirely familiar. In Dark Souls 1, medium shields that could parry, which I think was basically all of them, like it was specifically like medium and light shields could parry. I think there were some things that maybe were a little bit better at parrying. I haven't looked into the specific data on it, but it was relatively easy with basically all of your medium shields to get competent at parrying various types of enemies. So, for example, Silver Knights is one that immediately comes to mind as enemies where, honestly, I find parrying them to be sometimes easier than trying to attack them conventionally, especially the spear-wielding ones that tend to be very blocky with their shields. Parrying them isn't a very effective strategy for defeating them. And Dark Souls 2 made the parry windows variant for stuff a lot more, and certainly a lot more difficult for a lot of things, just because they're a lot more precise. And so this change, I don't like it, because I feel like it really affects the risk-reward calculation in a very negative way. Parrying is a risk, because you're dropping your block in order to do it. And the reward, of course, is creating an opening on the enemy for a high damage hit. The issue here that happens is when you're able to get comparable damage with a heavy weapon, and it's just as easy to, or by keeping an enemy in hit stun, when it's just as easy to basically hit stun an enemy to death, or to like take them out in a couple hits from a big heavy weapon, the reward for parrying no longer outweighs the risk. And so that means it's no longer as good of a strategy. And so I don't like that, because I like it when there are enemies where it's easy enough to parry that it feels that's reasonable enough to get mastery of it, that having enemies where like the way that I approach defeating this enemy is a parry riposte. I like that angle in the game. I like it when that's something that can be in the game. And I feel like the changes, in particular to parrying, changed that ratio enough where it felt like parries were too risky to compared to the reward. The mastery and ease of landing them became too difficult to make it reliable enough to make me really bother learning to do it well. And so I did not like that particular change. So the next thing I want to talk about is the ring slots. So Dark Souls 2 had 2 ring slots, and Dark Souls 2 has 4 ring slots. I'm trying to make sure I keep my numbers straight there. This is a change that I'm not entirely fond of. I know a lot of people liked being able to equip more rings. Realistically, you should be able to equip like 10 or whatever, but the issue... The thing about the rings is they're very difficult to balance well against each other, especially since there's just some categories of rings that are just generically good. I've talked about this before in, I think it was a guild chat or something, but the issue of things being generically good. But the basic summary is things like the Chloranthy ring are just good. Things like... what do they call it? The Dragon Rings, the Ring of Favor and Protection in Dark Souls 1, Havel's Ring, like a number of these rings, particularly like the ring, the Dragon's Rings, are just good, right? They're just good. You have to find a reason to not run them rather than a reason to run them. And the thing about having 4 ring slots is, by having more slots, it's more likely that some of those rings will just occupy a slot and never get displaced, because there is nothing... They're not... You'll have a couple of open slots that then are where the competition for more specialized rings goes. So things like the casting speed rings, for example. So in Dark Souls 1, when you have only 2 ring slots, suddenly things like Ring of Favor and Protection... Havel's Ring, Chloranthy Ring, they're all competing, like, your generically good rings are competing against each other more, and so that makes you want to, for example, say, I want to have the covetous gold serpent ring on in order to increase my drop rate. That means I have to give up one of these rings. Or I want the rusted iron ring in order to be able to move more quickly through, say, Blighttown or the bottom of the Sense Fortress or something. That means you're having to give up one of your rings. And so that incentivizes you to potentially change your build around, so that way you can, say, drop Havel's Ring, as an example, so you could get lighter. The other thing that happened is a bunch of the rings feel like a lot of those generically good rings, I think, got nerfed, in part because of the fact that they weren't competing against each other. So Ring of Favor and Protection is significantly stronger than the Dragon's Rings. Havel's Ring, I feel like, has gotten progressively worse in the games as the games go on. Things like that, where... And there's other things that they've changed to make something like Havel's Ring less important, with the way rolling stuff works, where they kind of made mid-rolls less punishing. But anyway, I'm not entirely fond of the 4 ring slots, just because I feel like ring balance is not necessarily making me like... It's not necessarily making me want to displace some of those generically good rings. I feel like the rings probably got worse in Dark Souls 3, but if I ever do a Dark Souls 3 retrospective, that's when I'll talk about that. I definitely prefer the way like Hollow Knight charms work than the Dark Souls rings, though, just because the notch system means that there's more knobs to turn in terms of balancing the rings out. The next thing I wanted to talk about was durability. So durability in Dark Souls 1 was a thing that existed, kind of, but what it basically meant is if you didn't spend a little bit of souls every now and then at the bonfire once you got the repair box, or at a blacksmith before then, your equipment would theoretically eventually break. Dark Souls 2 changed this so that way durability is something that you could see it underneath your weapons, so it's more visible, especially like actively. But B, it just automatically repaired at bonfires. You didn't have to worry about spending souls. You didn't have to worry about finicky menuing. I like that change. The other thing that I actually like is I like the bug in the PC version that makes durability wear out faster, because it actually makes durability a relevant mechanic. It feels much more relevant when I'm spending, or when my durability gets worn and stuff starts getting at risk much more often. It actually exists. This is in contrast to Dark Souls 3, where durability is especially irrelevant, because not even, for the most part, no weapon special attacks consume any durability either, as opposed to Dark Souls 1 and 2. So I actually like that bug, funnily enough, just because of that relevancy, although obviously it does create some pressure for people trying to make, or in the early game, if they have like only one good weapon or whatever. I'm not so sure about ring durability, but overall I like the change in durability. Okay, so I have a few more things I want to talk about here. The next one is leveling rate. So Dark Souls 2 is the game of the 3 Dark Souls games in which you can level the fastest. So on the one hand, I really like that, because I'm somebody who likes to make a character that can do everything. And so having the ability to actually get there reasonably in a reasonable way is something that I quite like. That's much more challenging in, say, Dark Souls 1 or even 3. So on the one hand, I like that. On the other hand, and the other thing too, actually, before I get to that, that's also really beneficial about it is agility, which I mentioned off the top, is such an impactful stat that being able to just dump into adaptability in order to get enough agility to make the game not feel clunky as crap really helps mitigate some of those issues. It's not great, but, you know, I'm glad that it's there, or glad that you can, like, get it more reasonably than it would be in, say, Dark Souls 1. Imagine if you were playing with Dark Souls 1 leveling rates and you just have to dump everything into resilience or whatever that stat is that nobody uses in order to, like, make the game play properly in many regards. So agility was just a bad idea all around with the way that they implemented it. But on the other hand, one of the problems with being able to level as quickly as you can in Dark Souls 2 is that while there are a lot of stats, in the end it's not that difficult to really, like, fill everything up, like get all of your stats up to the soft caps. And that can result in characters being very samey, where, you know, like, it's a universal issue. I mean, issue is dependent upon your point of view. I view it as an issue in the Dark Souls games, where all of the eventual endpoint of all characters is to be identically statted. Like, that's defines max level, is 99 in every stat. And so that's kind of the eventual endpoint. I like games like Guild Wars 1, for example, where you cannot max out everything. You have to pick what you're maxing out. And so I kind of would like a Souls game that has a level cap, at least theoretically. And so, like, that makes characters, you have to intentionally figure out where you're going to end up. So with Dark Souls 2, the characters kind of converge on a sort of, I don't know, mid point much more rapidly, which I'm not as big of a fan of, just in terms of making every character kind of feel the same, with the major differences just being, like, what equipment you have, because that has a big impact on what you can do, which brings me actually to my next point, which is the accessibility of upgrade materials. So I like that late game you can purchase unlimited quantities of shards and chunks for Titanite. And so that's regular shards, large shards, Titanite chunks, and that slabs are pretty easily farmable in Drangleic Castle. I wish that they're purchasable. I'm very frustrated by the change, in particular to Twinkling Titanite no longer being infinitely purchasable, as it was in Dark Souls 1. And again, like Dragonbone, which replaces Demon Titanite, if I'm remembering everything correctly, is also a pain to get. There's a bonfire I have in Shulva that has a ridiculously high aesthetic level just because of farming a particular chest that has, or I forget if it's a chest or just an area, but that has 3 each of Twinkling Titanite and Dragonbone. So I am somebody who, I mentioned earlier, I like to have a character that can do everything. This means like getting all of the boss weapons, getting everything to max level, maxing out all of my armor. I just like getting everything to max. I want a one of everything at, max stats or whatever. And this is just a general complaint that I have about the Dark Souls games in general, is that there's a certain point where you reach diminishing returns of versatility. And what I mean by that is, once you have, say, your 4th or 5th weapon, you're really like, okay, you've covered probably most of your bases in terms of like variety, and it becomes less and less beneficial to, I don't know, upgrade 3 different types of rapiers because, you have your 3 different, I don't remember, or like your Uchi Katana and your Iaido and whatever, or Black Steel Katana and Uchi Katana and Chaos Blade and Dark Drift, and at a certain point it's like, okay, how far is too far on this? And boss weapons and Twinkling Titanite and stuff like this, like, I understand why you want to make during the core playthrough, right? For balancing purposes, for pacing, for all of these things, you want to limit accessibility of upgrade materials. You want to pace them a certain way to be able to produce a certain experience. And that's something that I fully appreciate. It's just, for somebody like me, at a certain point, you're asking me to put in a lot of work in order to be able to level up all of the weapons, and I feel like it's a little excessive. Especially when there's so many weapons in the game, which I think is really cool. I like having that many weapons in the game. But I want that to be something where once I get to a certain point, I'm able to get unlimited quantities of these weapons. So it's something where I would really like it if once you... And one of the other changes that I'd like is that it doesn't automatically jump you into New Game Plus, right? So I'd like it if once you beat Nishandra or whatever and go through the credits that it was just infinitely purchasable. Twinkling Titanite, Dragonbone, Titanite slabs, all of the upgrade materials, infinitely purchasable. Because at this point you're no longer worrying about pacing for the game, and it makes it much more convenient to the player who does want to upgrade, like get all of the boss weapons and everything. Because it's not an interesting challenge, it's not interesting gameplay just farming a bunch of upgrade materials. And that's not necessarily what the core experience is, and I just want to be able to get all of my weapons that I want to be able to get, and I don't want to have to spend a bunch of time collecting upgrade materials. So this is just a general complaint that I actually have about all of the Dark Souls games. What I would prefer is either if there was like some sort of special quest that you could undertake to be able to unlock something that lets you just have unlimited Titanite, or if it was that you had to upgrade the blacksmith's hammer so that they could upgrade your weapon to the higher levels or something like that, where they could still use the same sort of pacing and all of that sort of stuff, benefits that they get from the Titanite system, but where it would be reasonable to, at some point in time, late game, say, okay, you've proven that you want to upgrade stuff, we're going to facilitate you doing that. Because again, you get diminishing returns in having, more varieties of weapons. Like, do I really need a +5 Pursuer's Greatsword and a +5 King's Greatsword and a +5 Ruler's Greatsword? All of these different, like, Lost Center Sword. Like, after a while, these things are getting, like, I'm not getting that much more of an advantage by adding this other max upgraded weapon. So just, why not just let me do it? And do it in a more reasonable way. So that's something that I feel kind of strongly about. The final thing that I want to talk about today was just the upgrade system in general, in terms of the change from having different varieties of Titanites to having most weapons upgrading with Titanite shards, Titanite chunks, Titanite slabs, and then using the Infusion system to change their properties. This is in contrast to Dark Souls 1, where you have you start off with Titanite shards, and then at that point things branch, and you can upgrade to a +6 weapon, to a raw weapon. I don't know why you would, but you could upgrade to a raw with large shards, or you could use green Titanite shards to become magic, divine, or fire. And then once you get up to a +10 weapon, you could make it a +11 weapon and go all the way up to +15, or you could make it crystal. That's a dubious choice, but you can do that. Or you could make it lightning and take those up to +5. And those would continue using Titanite chunks and Titanite slabs. And then divine you could either continue it in divine at divine +6 up to divine +10, or you could make it a cult up to a cult +5. Those used white Titanite chunks and white Titanite slabs. And then there's the magic ones, enchanted and magic, and then fire +10 and chaos +5. So that system is something that I kind of like the mystique of it. I liked the finding the different embers, like the divine ember and the large divine ember and the occult ember, and just stuff like that that would have some more lore significance and stuff like that. On the other hand, there is a streamlinedness to the Dark Souls 2 and 3 style of Infusion that makes it that way. You have a lot more flexibility with your weapons. If you want to change a weapon infusion at some point in time, you can much more feasibly. But that also means there's a little bit less buy-in, if that makes sense. The more resources you have to sink into something, the more buy-in you have into it, right? It's sort of the sunk cost fallacy type thing. Not quite, but basically the more resources you've poured into something, the more value it has to you. And so it's slightly less resources with the infusion system, but that's okay. It's like, where do you want the player to kind of spend their effort? On the other hand, the Dark Souls 1 style of upgrading to different types allows you to kind of encourage players to branch out a little bit more with their types, because like maybe you've gotten yourself up, to a plus whatever weapon this way, but you've got all of these upgrade materials for different branch lying around. Like, it separates the branches out. They don't all overlap. I don't know. That's kind of a mixed bag. And overall, I'm fine with the way that From Software has been streamlining this, like from the incredibly arcane Demon Souls system to Dark Souls 1's more straightforward system than that. Believe it or not, to what they've done in 2 and 3. But anyway, those are some of my thoughts about specific character stuff. So what I'm planning on next time is talking about level and world design, which I'm sure will be popular. Maybe. We'll see. Hopefully people are enjoying this, but I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here, and until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.